The corporal found me sitting on my bunk, childishly pouting, staring mulishly at nothing, my rifle across my knees. "Why aren't you cleaning your weapon?" he asked. "Because it's already clean," I said. "Says who?" said he. "The lieutenant," said I. The fact that this was true did not diminish my insubordination. The subsequent proceedings could end only in my dismissal. I knew that. But even when Lacey begged me to go through the motions of obedience for my own sake, not to mention the sake of those who, having rated me high on their fuck your buddy sheets, were afraid their judgment would be questioned, I refused. Thus I was haled before a hastily assembled court-martial Monday morning. I still wouldn't budge. I told the kindly, troubled lieutenant colonel who presided over the court that I had joined the Marines to fight, not to kiss asses and wade through the very sort of chicken shit we were supposed to be warring against. That, I'm afraid, is exactly how I put it. I made but one request. I asked to be sent to my father's regiment, the 5th Marines. That was denied me. I was warranted as a corporal, to be jumped to sergeant when I reached my new post in Tent City, New River, North Carolina, where new battalions were forming for imminent transport overseas. Thus I departed Virginia, an immature knight in tin armour. The rheostat was turned down several notches, but I still had my petty pride, not to mention the fact that I now outranked my father. It was in North Carolina's Tent City that Marine General Alexander A. Vandergrift had assembled the men whom he was to lead on Guadalcanal. Samuel B. Griffith, my old commanding officer, recalls, "Headquarters Marine Corps now began pumping personnel into New River to bring Vandergraw IFT's command to war strength. Odd lots arrived almost daily. They were a motley bunch. Hundreds were young recruits only recently out of boot camp at Paris Island. Others were older. These were the professionals, the old breed of United States Marines. Many had fought Cacos in Haiti, Banditos in Nicaragua, and French, English, Italian, and American soldiers in bars from Shanghai, Manila, Tsingtao, Tientsin, and Peking. They were inveterate gamblers and accomplished scroungers who drank hair tonic in preference to post-exchange beer, horse piss, cursed with wonderful fluency, and never went to chapel, the God box. They knew they were tough, and they knew they were good. There were enough of them to leaven the division, and to impart to the thousands of younger men a share of both the unique spirit which animated them and the skills they possessed. I remember one of them, Master Gunnery Sergeant Lou Diamond, as a rumpled old man in soiled dungarees, with an untidy goatee and a pronounced starboard list when he was drunk, which was often. In Tent City he looked like a bum. He reminded me of some cynical old chimpanzee who goes through the motions for the sake of the bananas. But the scatological excesses of a Genet tell us more about a man's fibre than the closely reasoned insights of a Gide. If there had been such a thing as a black belt for mortarmen, Lou Diamond would have won it. On Guadalcanal, his accuracy with his 81mm piece was extraordinary. There was a myth that he had sunk a Japanese destroyer by manipulating increments and lobbing a mortar shell down its stack, apocryphal, but the very fact that it was widely believed suggests Lou's immense reputation. My own reputation was quite different. I became what was called an intelligence man. In World War II, our table of organization, TO, provided that the headquarters company of each Marine Corps line battalion include a curious unit called an intelligence section. I was informed that I would lead such a section in my battalion. The unit's duties were defined as scouting, mapping, interrogation of prisoners, and other normal duties of the intelligence section. Mapping in the middle of battle? Questioning POWs whose language we didn't speak? And what were other normal duties? I was told that we were to estimate enemy strength on the battalion's front, to identify enemy units by the flashes on the tunics of their dead, to patrol deep behind enemy lines, to advise our junior officers who were having trouble reading maps, and to carry messages to company commanders whose field radios, SCR 536S and SCR 300S, were out of order. Only the last three of these, patrolling, reading maps, and carrying messages, proved to be practical. No Marine in the middle of a firefight, however clever he may have been, knew any more about the foe than the rifleman in the next foxhole. Even then, the Marine Corps seemed to sense this, for we were being taught other roles: wiring, mortaring, replacing fallen men in our battalion's 3 companies: D, Dog, E, Easy, and F, Fox. Our section had the additional grim responsibility of clipping dog tags from the necks of Marines killed in action. To allow for this, 5 men were added. At times I had as many as 19 lads on our roster. We called ourselves the Raggedy-Ass Marines. The rest of the battalion called us the Bandits. Whatever the name, I was this odd lot's honcho. We were, in fact, very odd. Most of us were military misfits, college students who had enlisted in a fever of patriotism and been rejected as officer candidates because, for various reasons, we either despised the OCS system openly or did not conform to the established concept of how officers should look, speak, and act. For example, Chet Prziastawaki, who had been a running back for Colgate, had a build like Charles Atlas but the voice of a Wagnerian soprano. If he shouted, the effect was that of Kirsten Flagstad screaming. Bo Tatum of the University of Virginia had no sense of direction. At Quantico, he not only flunked map reading, he repeatedly led patrols into Virginia swamps never penetrated before. Many, like Prziastawaki, lacked command presence. There was always something lacking that the Marine Corps wanted and they didn't have. Rip Thorpe came from Fordham. He had been on the first-string basketball varsity. He would have made a far better section leader than I did, and in fact I went to our battalion officer and told him so. The lieutenant threw me out of his tent. Rip, it developed, had a very black mark beside his name. He thought military traditions, close-order drill, and the rest of it absolutely ridiculous. So he laughed at them. Nell was proud to have an interpreter in the regiment. He ordered Whitey to give Japanese lessons to officers and senior NCOs every day. Whitey did it convincingly, with a blackboard and chalk. I still remember his Japanese equivalent for Voulez-vous coucher avec moi? It was Naka Naka Eida Kudasai. It is meaningless, but we all committed it to memory. His hoax went unsuspected until the last months of the war, when, impersonating an officer once more, he was unmasked by a captain, a graduate of one of the Japanese language schools that had been set up after Pearl Harbor, and were finally, too late, bearing fruit. All that lay ahead as we trained in North Carolina, where already there was a widespread awareness in the battalion that the Raggedy Asses were unsuitably bookish, slack on the drill field, and generally beneath the fastidious stateside standards established in the Corps' 169-year history. If there had been such a thing as a military quotient, the spit and polish equivalent of an intelligence quotient, our MQ would have been pegged at about 78. It is fair to add that this rating would have been confined to our parade ground performance. We were regarded as good combat prospects. All of us, I believe, had qualified as sharpshooters, and one other, like me, was an expert rifleman. It was thought, and as it proved, correctly thought, that we would be useful in battle. Our problem, or rather the problem of our leaders, was that we lacked what the British called Quetta manners. We weren't properly starched and blancoed, weren't martially prepossessing, weren't, in a word, good for the regiment's image. We were rarely given liberty because the skipper was ashamed to let civilians see us wearing the Corps uniform. We looked like a slack-wire, baggy-pants act out of a third-rate circus. Shirt tails out, buttons missing, fore and aft, overseas, caps down around our ears. These were signs that we had lost our initial enthusiasm for being crack troops, either in OCS or on bases elsewhere, and were playing our roles of incorrigible eccentrics to the hilt. We looked like caricatures in the Leatherneck, the Marine Corps equivalent of Yank, and the only reasons our betters allowed us to stay together, setting a bad example for one another and damaging battalion élan, were our scores on intelligence tests and our special training. Between our arrival in New River and our assignment to Tent City, we had all attended something called intelligence school. It was largely a repetition of Quantico classes. Theoretically, we emerged from the school as experts in identifying enemy units, recognizing the silhouettes of enemy planes, Japanese and German, we still didn't know where we were going, reconnoitering behind enemy lines, and so on. It was all very vague. In Tent City, we carried out exhausting exercises in the Carolina boondocks, inflating black rubber boats and silently guiding them toward beaches, carrying out simulated missions at night, and becoming snarled in bales of communications wire. I remember one gigantic ball of wire, about 15 feet in diameter. The lieutenant commanding the communications platoon, also a part of headquarters company, came over and stared at it in utter amazement. He had been an étant executive in civilian life, and he told me in an almost reverential voice that never, not even when serving as an advisor to one of Central America's banana republics, had he ever seen such an inextricable tangle. "It would take 20 years for a man to straighten that out," he said. "Let me get my camera." He sent the developed prints back to his company's New York office, where, he later told me, they were dismissed as fakes. That was one of our minor disasters. Whenever it was Bo Tatum's turn to keep the map, we were an even greater trial. Our patrols would disappear into the piney woods, subsisting there on K&C rations, utterly lost, until we were found thrashing around in the bush and led back by a rescue party from the battalion's 81mm mortar platoon, our long-suffering neighbours in Tent City. This sounds, I know, like an American version of Jaroslav Hasek's good soldier Schweik. It wasn't, really. In our own odd way, we loved the Marine Corps. It was the Emperor's clothes, not the Emperor himself, that we ridiculed. At the time, we thought of this training period as a waste of time. Actually, it was a useful shakedown cruise. Like couples in forced marriages, we were compelled to explore one another's traits. On the whole, we liked what we found. Discovering common tastes, our morale rose. Part of the section formed a quintet built around Przyjastawaki. They sang songs like Moonlight Bay, The Old Apple Tree, Someone to Watch Over Me, and Let the Rest of the World Go By. Another part, with some overlapping from the singers, played Hearts night and day. Barney, Zepp and I, intellectual snobs, played chess. We developed an affected jargon. We said not shit, but fecal matter from a desiccated yak. Because, despite the TO, we were after all just heavily laden infantrymen, we groaned, "My aching back," or simply, "my back." Not long before we boarded troop trains for the West Coast, we were all offered 72-hour passes. There would be no second chance, we were warned, but I nevertheless declined, believing my case for leave later would be stronger without it. I was hoping for a few days with my mother and didn't want to jeopardize that. Most of the others took off for New York in an incredible automobile they had bought for $25. It broke down repeatedly on both the trip up and the return. They had just 5 hours in Manhattan. But afterward it sounded like so much fun that I wished I'd gone. Meanwhile, I was trying to learn to be a leader. It would never be easy for me. I felt bogus. But by giving my people a free rein and arguing their cases with the skipper and staff NCOs, I was slowly building a reservoir of goodwill. During our North Carolina weeks, I had just 2 problems, Hunky O'Banion and Shiloh Davidson. Hunky thought I was soft. He was a born griper, forever threatening to write his congressman, whose name, unfortunately, he didn't know. Though he was naturally bright, his values were those of the Philadelphia slum in which he had grown up. He expected an iron hand. When I refused to flex one, he kept trying to incite me. Since I knew he had been a Golden Gloves boxer, I was wary of him. I sought appeasement. It didn't work. Soon he was taunting me openly, calling me Priscilla. The others were enjoying the spectacle, so finally, reluctantly, I invited him to join me in the boondocks. He knocked me down. I rose, and he knocked me down again, and again, and again. My nose felt dented, and my mouth was full of blood, but with the help of a nearby sapling, I laboured back upright each time. In the beginning, Hunky enjoyed himself, but then it became too easy. After I had been flattened 5 times, he muttered, "Ah, screw it," and strode back to camp. I cannot say I gained anything from this one-sided bout, but clearly he had lost something. He started showing up in sickbay each morning, complaining of a strained sacroiliac. Back problems were known as the surest way to a survey. They always puzzled physicians. Later, whenever we were headed for combat, Whitey Dumas, the con man, would moan and wiggle his shoulder muscles until the sighing corpsman sent him to a base hospital. So Hunky returned to Philadelphia, to the vast relief of one scrawny sergeant of Marines. Shiloh Davidson was another matter. He was, and plainly considered himself to be, at the opposite end of the social spectrum from Hunky, though Hunky was too isolated in his own cultural cage to be touched by Shiloh's snubs. The Davidsons were in the social register, members of the New York Yacht Club, and given to annual tours of Europe. Shiloh had nothing against me, provided I didn't throw my genealogy at him, but his feelings toward officers continued to border on the homicidal. One day he was routinely assigned to police duty in officers' country. This entailed picking up debris, squaring away tents, cleaning up the head, and filling the Lister bag. At some point that day, he was struck by a mad flash of inspiration. Since officers regarded enlisted men as numbskulls, he reasoned, he would offer them proof of it. Water and gasoline were kept in almost identical green 5-gallon jerry cans, distinguished by the colour of the X's on the outside, white for water and yellow for gasoline. The Lister bag was empty, so Shiloh filled it, with gas. A first lieutenant, returning parched from a training patrol, filled his canteen cup, swallowed once, and spluttered fuel all over himself. The strange thing is that Davidson's assumption was proved right. No one reproached him except me. For the first time in my life, I threatened another man and meant it. Lieutenant Colonel Crank, very upset, vented his wrath on the innocent platoon leader. The lieutenant was declared a fire hazard, confined to his tent for 3 days, forbidden visitors, and ordered to give up cigarettes for a week. The poor victim was a chain smoker. I thought he, at least, might give me a hard time. He never mentioned it to me. Nobody expected much from the raggedy-ass Marines then. Our regimental commander, Colonel Horace F. Hastings, USMC, a.k.a. the Old Turk, was the kind of colourful hard-charger that the Marine Corps has always valued highly. The years had shrunk his slabs of muscle to gristle, and he had a grooved, wind-bitten face with wattles that turned crimson when he was enraged, which was often. I remember his brooding eyes, corded neck, sinewy hands, veined nose, the touch of crimson at his temples, and the way his lips nibbled at each other like those of a nervous horse. It was reported that he was a native of Vulture's Gulch, Arizona, a community that, I later discovered, does not exist. If the town was bogus, so in part was he. Our colonel, though doubtless brave, was not very bright. Inside his second-rate mind, one felt, a third-rate mind was struggling toward the surface. But on one point, officers, NCOs, and privates were in full agreement. He was a terrific swordsman. The evening before we sailed for the Solomons, I saw him surrounded by young women in the lobby of San Diego's U.S. Grant Hotel, wearing dress blues and all his decorations, striking the lordly pose of a czar carefully choosing tonight's bedmate. Recently, I learned he is living in London, an octogenarian pleasuring English girls who hadn't been born when we fought under him. In the field, he adopted a piratical stance, wearing a bleached khaki fore and aft cap pushed rakishly to the back of his head, his hands on his lithe hips, his chin tilted up aggressively. He looked every inch the gifted commander. Alas, he wasn't. He was relieved in the middle of his first battle for incompetence. He was the most redundant man I have ever known, forever saying things like, "Eat lots of food and plenty of it," "Here in Dixie, we're in the deep South," and "Keep fit and healthy." In San Diego, he announced, "We're going to sail tomorrow aboard ship." Our elusive Japanese language interpreter would, he told me, meet officers and senior non-coms on the General C.G. Morton's fantail in the stern. On Guadalcanal, he predicted, "Sunrise will come at dawn." The Marine Corps was his whole life. The Corps birthday is November 10th. On such occasions, even when in the jungle, he would wear all his medals, not just the ribbons, but the actual medals, and preside over an officers' banquet. The high moment was always his toast to the Corps, during which he recited all Corps victories, including, erroneously, Bull Run, where Leathernecks broke and ran. Most of their officers had defected to the Confederate Marine Corps. The United States went unmentioned, and though the regimental colours were there, the Stars and Stripes was conspicuously absent. The old Turk had had a strange career. Bit by bit we pieced it together from old salts, 30-year men who had fought with him in World War I. Hastings was a Mustang. In 1918 he had been a first soldier, a top kick. At the height of the San Miguel offensive, he had misunderstood an order. The word was passed to fall back, but he thought it meant the opposite. So while the others withdrew, he thought they were bolting. Hastings plunged ahead. As it happened, the Germans had just decided to retreat, so he seemed to have taken the position single-handed. He won a Navy Cross and put up second lieutenant bars. Between wars, he picked up a Silver Star and 2 Purple Hearts in the Banana Republics. Until he was appointed our commanding officer, he had never led a large body of troops. Indeed, his most notable professional accomplishment was the invention of a device designed to catch insects. A wit in the 3rd Battalion spread the rumour that Hastings's middle initial stood for flytrap. Truth is often veiled in myth, and so it was here. Bedevilled by bugs in his Caribbean campaigns, he had devised a complicated cage, with many tunnels, chambers, and mazes, which he believed would ensnare flies faster than the stickiest flypaper. The result was a celebrated field manual. Featuring detailed drawings and precise instructions, the prey form a cone of dispersion, a beaten zone with the slope of plane A, determining the approximate curve of the trajectories. It was adopted by the Navy Department as the M1A1 flytrap. All the information necessary to put the contraption together was in the manual, but until he became our leader, neither the inventor nor anyone else had actually built one. Now he ordered it done. Our company constructed a snare, faithfully following the directions, and we were told that the colonel would inspect it at 0900 the following Saturday to count the number of flies ambushed. A day passed, then another. The trap was empty. The regiment confronted its first crisis. If we stayed on course, Saturday would bring catastrophe. It would be as though Odysseus, having said his farewells before leaving for a historic journey, went down to the sea only to find that the boat had left without him. Foreseeing this, Hastings's executive officer grimly ordered that enlisted personnel capture 10 flies each and put them in the trap. Mike Powers gave me this appalling directive and threatened to strangle me when I asked for it in writing. I told the section to think of it as a challenge. It was. We barely beat the Saturday deadline, but we did make it. The colonel was obviously pleased. Heartened, he told the exec that if that many bugs could be enmeshed by a trap with one opening, why not catch twice as many with 2 openings? The exec, for the first, and to my knowledge the only time, made a genuine contribution to the war effort. If there were 2 entries, he discreetly suggested, the quarry could fly in one and out the other. Hastings pondered this. At last, he said it was a good idea with lots of merit. A week later, the trap was quietly dismantled. Except for his dismissal, I was present when he was fired and was embarrassed by his humiliation. That was my worst experience under the colonel. It was not, however, the worst for certain collegiate ex-jocks. Athletes tended to join the Marine Corps. Their values and skills were appreciated there. One morning, Hastings and Colonel Branch Packard, commander of the 4th Marines, discovered that each could form a complete All-American football team from the men on his roster. Born competitors, they decided to have a football game. The fact that the temperature was 103 degrees in the shade didn't discourage them. Neither did the absence of a field. That was what enlisted men were for. So we cleared a more or less level area 120 yards long and 60 yards wide. Goalposts were erected. Then we tried to remove all the stones, an insuperable task. The players, most of them junior officers, had suggested they play touch, but both colonels indignantly rejected the idea. Marines wouldn't settle for sissy stuff. The day of the big game dawned hot and muggy. A little podium had been erected at the 50-yard line, protected from the sun by a huge green parasol. There the 2 regimental commanders stood erect, like sahibs at a durbar, while the sweating, gasping jocks, wearing only camouflaged skivvy shorts, toiled and grunted. Most of the rest of us encircled the field, cheering mechanically, though I left in disgust after the first few plays. Later, I learned that the Navy doctors, alarmed at the incidence of heat prostration on the field, had demanded that the contest end after the first quarter. It was a scoreless tie. Nevertheless, the notion that good athletes make good fighters persisted. Had our leaders paid closer attention, they would have found that ectomorphs and endomorphs fight just as well on the battlefield as mesomorphs. Whatever Wellington said about Waterloo being won on the playing fields of Eton, it didn't apply in the Pacific. The war against Japan was won by the muscular, the skinny, the fat, the long, the short, and the tall. It was won in the gut. Once we boarded our troop train for California, I knew my expectations of fighting the Nazis were a pipe dream. Now I would have to learn to hate the Japanese, a people whom at the moment I hated less than, say, I hated the troop train. We slept there in built-in tiers of bunks, like those in SS concentration camps, and we all swore that no one could be confined in closer quarters and survive. We were wrong. Troop transports, APAs, followed the same principle and were even more cramped. Like Lenin in his sealed train, we rolled swiftly and unheralded across the Deep South, Arkansas, Oklahoma, the Texas Panhandle, New Mexico, Arizona, and finally California, where we bivouacked under canvas in Linda Vista, a few miles north of San Diego. The 1st Marine Division had sailed for Guadalcanal from San Francisco, Norfolk, and New Orleans, but our port of embarkation would be Dago. This was my introduction to Southern California, and my first impression was that it was wonderful. At dawn, we would rise in a gentle mist, which would burn off by mid-morning. The rest of the day was fresh, sunny, and glorious. The harbour was sapphire blue, the shore rocks emerald. At dusk, ribbons of purple streaked the hills inland, the western sky reddened, and the sun's drop was spectacular. Most evenings we had liberty in Dago. Nights we slept beneath blankets, some 35 summers later. I returned to San Diego. Everyone had told me I wouldn't recognize it, but I did. The smog was new, and Linda Vista had vanished beneath weeds and new construction, but the part of the city I knew best was still familiar. The Grant Hotel, though seedy and dwarfed by the gleaming Little Americana Westgate Hotel across the street, looked as it did from the outside, which is mostly how I saw it then. The uniform store still stands on Broadway, 4 blocks from the waterfront, though it now provides uniforms for nurses, chauffeurs, doormen, orderlies, elevator operators, and policemen. Balboa Park is largely unchanged. A short walk from there takes you to the enormous Marine Corps parade ground, where, with a little tug, you watch field-hatted DIs chewing out trembling boots. Across the water, an immense aircraft carrier looms greyly. The gaping docks at the foot of Broadway are unused, but if you close your eyes, you can recall boarding an APA wearing a field marching pack, your sea bag on your shoulder, saluting the ensign on the fantail even though you couldn't see him. And a brief stroll from the transport bays takes you to the railroad station, where I, or more correctly, Barney, met my mother. This was a terrible time for her. She had already lost her husband. My baby brother and I were all she had. To support herself, she had taken a secretarial job at the Federal Reserve Bank in Oklahoma City. We had both assumed I would have at least a few days' leave before sailing. As it turned out, the only way she could say goodbye to me was to come to Dago. That day, for unexplained reasons, all liberty was cancelled, so I went over the hill, climbing a wire fence. Barney went with me. By now we were skilled in the arts of evasion. We could almost enter a phone booth and leave by a side door, and we were deft improvisers. We didn't know whether my mother would be arriving by train or by bus. Actually, she was aboard a train, standing up for most of the 36-hour trip, so he covered one depot while I covered the other. We met every batch of arrivals for 12 hours. Then he found her, and I embraced her and took her to the Grant, where I had hired a room. The manager intercepted us outside the elevators. She has always looked much younger than she is. He misunderstood our relationship, and I was about to fly at him when he recoiled, hopping, and apologized. We ate at a little red waterfront sandwich shop, strolled around the square outside the hotel, and returned to her room. For the first time since leaving for Paris Island, I could take a real bath. Like Blanche Dubois, in my youth I felt deprived without frequent soaks in a hot tub. And then the two of us talked hour after hour. The mother-child dyad is central to any man's development, and this was especially true of me, for I had always been more anima than animus, more feminine in the Jungian sense, sensitive, poetic, creative, warm, than masculine, direct, orderly, logical, assertive. I had begun to change since putting on a uniform, but my mother was still the sun around whom I orbited. We reminisced about my childhood, about nursery stories from those days, even sang some nursery songs. We didn't talk much about my father. That wound was too recent even to have begun healing. Later I remembered those hours of tender talk when I read why MacArthur, in writing post-war Japan's constitution, gave Nipponese women the vote. It was, he said, the most effective way of curbing samurai militarism. Men make war, he told his staff. Women hate it. Certainly my mother did, and no one had better reason. This frail, loving woman, incapable of hurting a soul, had been raised by the fierce Confederate Valkyries and shattered by the death of the war-crippled man she loved. Now she had to see her son off to even more terrible fighting. She gave me a watch, which miraculously survived the war and still keeps good time. Then she rode down to the lobby with me and we embraced. Outside on Broadway, I looked back through a window. She was still where I had left her, standing alone, crying. Our eyes locked. I turned away, my eyes also damp. In many ways I was still a boy. But I wanted to be a man, and an essential step in the process, one my mother wouldn't have understood, was the forfeiture of my own virginity. To everything there is a season and a time to every purpose under the heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to kill and a time to heal. There is also a time to get laid, and I was due. We weren't going to be stateside much longer. There was ominous activity around the APAs by the docks. But my prospects for strange purple sins were improving. I was surer of myself, readier to take charge. Being a sergeant had done that for me too. And I had a couple of good leads. The best one came from an unlikely source, a fellow sergeant named Bearus Miller. Even by Marine Corps standards, Miller was crude. If he felt horny and no relief was in sight, he said, he would walk into a crowd of women, pull out my cock, and burst out crying. That hadn't been necessary here, he said, because a girl named Taffy Meredith from his Midwest hometown was working for the government in a town south of Dago. She had lined up a bombshell for him. He had screwed Taffy herself before enlisting. She puts out, he said, and she's classy. Her father was a judge. She had been a co-ed at Michigan State. Now she had a defense job. She thought it patriotic. Besides, all the boys had left the campus. Bearass had told her he'd try to find someone suitable for her here. Lovely tale, more your type than mine, he said. He'd phone her, tell her I was collegiate, and set up a tryst. We met in the San Diego Zoo. The lioness was pissing at the time. There I was, as agreed, and just as I heard a feminine rustle approach, this coarse beast ejected a stream of urine like water from a garden hose. I stared at it, enthralled and blushing, wondering darkly whether Bearass could have arranged this. It would have been just like him. Then I heard the girl giggling. She touched my sleeve and said softly, "Slim?" The lioness finished, and I turned, doffing my barracks cap and saying, "Taffy?" Neither of us spoke for a long moment. She was giving my fraternity ring a sidelong glance, and I was speechless. In a lifetime, a man may encounter 3 or 4 young women with such extraordinary figures, and hers was my first. But there was more to her than that, an indefinable air of breeding. Bearass was right. Taffy had class. Her upper lip was long and aristocratic, her neck high, her smallest movements dainty, her spill of hair just the right shade of light auburn. Altogether, she was beautiful in a hieratic, mystic way. Her dress was designed along classic Greek lines. White matte silk crossed cleverly at her throat and then fell away in liquid folds. Her arms were bare. Earrings were her only jewellery. On my initiative, I think it was mine. In our generation, a girl like that always made you believe it was yours. We impulsively held both hands, face to face, and rocked back on our heels like a couple in a square dance, appraising each other in a growing silence. At that time, less than 1% of the population had a college background, a tenth of today's. We paired off, speaking almost simultaneously. Michigan State and Massachusetts State, Chi Omega and Lambda Chi, varsity swimmer and cheerleader. Simultaneously, we both burst into laughter, as though we had heard a marvelous intramural joke. In less than a minute, we found that back east we had 3 mutual friends, and in another minute, still laughing but holding just one hand now, her right and my left, we were frolicking through Balboa Park naturally and easily, and, we thought, as gracefully as Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, pausing to sing the old songs so recently heard on campuses across America but already dated. We'll build a bungalow big enough for 2, big enough for 2, my honey, big enough for 2, Tualuma Luma. Please do to me what you did to Marie last Saturday night. First you caressed her, then you undressed her. And words which still haunt me, though my college students today tell me they are sexist. A man without a woman is like a ship without a sail, is like a boat without a rudder, is like a kite without a tail. On a park bench, she raised her hands to her hair, and the movement did something for her. I asked her about her work, and we were howling before she could finish. In the data analysis group of the aptitude test subunit of the worker analysis section of the Division of Occupational Analysis, and manning tables of the Bureau of Labour Utilization of the War Manpower. We dried our eyes after that one, and she said seriously that she had heard scuttlebutt about the women Marines. She intended to join up. Later, I heard more about these female leathernecks. The men in the Corps called them BAMs, for broad-assed Marines, and they called the men HAMs, for hairy-assed Marines. Men like Bearus enjoyed such exchanges, but whatever Taffy and I were, we weren't vulgar. I know what we thought we were. We thought we were in love. Already on the bench, once the giggling stopped, we were caressing each other, our bodies arching, yearning for each other. It seemed remarkable at the time, but of course it wasn't. In peacetime we wouldn't have reached this point until the 8th or 9th date, but the clock and the calendar were moving relentlessly, and it seemed a millennium since either of us had met someone from the same background. In my next incarnation, I may choose not to fall in love in wartime, not unless I am at least a major and can afford a room of my own. Taffy and I had literally nowhere to go. Already other couples were passing slowly, eyeing the bench. We parted then, but the next night I took her to a movie, Mrs. Miniver, during which I established that Taffy had an active tongue, wore Munsing wear, and responded to my restless foreplay with the normal prickling of erectile tissues, labial weights and thickenings. As the last reel spun, she explored me. I was fully tumescent. My fingers entered her, 2 of them, then 3, then 4. She whispered, "Girls are sort of elastic." All this was wrong, and I think it was jarring for both of us. Such a poem of a girl deserved to be wooed by candlelight, with gentle reassurances and Debussy in the background. At the very least, I should have given her a whirlwind courtship, with gifts and flowers, and above all, a mattress. We were not this kind of people, but they were that kind of times. I had to keep glancing furtively at my watch. I was due back at Linda Vista in a half hour. Payday was 2 days away, and I wanted to reach an understanding now. After the show, in a rundown diner which advertised Scotch-type whiskey and hamburger-type meat, one of those places with 2 price lists, servicemen paying more, I took my courage à deux mains and made a puerile remark, one I'd been rehearsing during the movie, about the taste of the original apple remaining in our mouths. Again she made it easy for me. She eyed me, then dropped her eyes, sighed, and said, "I guess I'm kind of round-heeled." I looked blank. The expression was new to me. So she said, "You know, a pushover. Miller probably told you. I've been naughty, really bad a couple of times. I was nervous about this blind date." She took my hand and looked up again. "But now I'd like to be with you if you want." In those days, hotel clerks gave couples a hard time if the woman wasn't wearing a wedding ring. She said she could borrow one. I stammered something about reserving a room at the Grant right now, and after a telephone call there, we were all set for Saturday night. There was a bad moment when I came out of the phone booth. She was nursing her elbows. She bowed her head and mumbled, "I feel dirty." But when I kissed her, she kissed back hard. I was elated. I knew Powers would cover for me. We would have the whole night. As we parted, her eyes widened, then looked heavy. Her mouth softened. Her lips silently said, "Slim." She rose and left, her walk slow and swaying. Back at the camp, in the NCO slop chute, Bearass leered and demanded, within hearing of a half-dozen other sergeants, a full report on my patrol. I was angry, which was unreasonable of me. He, after all, had made my assignation possible. Although I was trying to keep my romantic feelings on a lofty plane, on another level they were quite primitive, even exploitive. Part of me wanted to tumble the girl out of sheer lewdness and male vanity. I wanted to be in like Flynn. Try as I might to suppress it, a crude tabloid headline kept flashing across my mind. Manchester gets ashes hauled, puts blocks to knock out co-ed. I wanted to take out bragging ads, rent billboards, buy airtime to announce that I had hit the motherlode. Nevertheless, there was more to our relationship than that. I believed that I had adored her at first sight, and that I wanted more than carnal knowledge of her. I felt sure that each of us could live joyously in the other. Subconsciously, I suppose, I wanted to leave my seed in her before sailing. Subconsciously, perhaps, she wanted to receive it. Our time together had been cruelly brief, though thousands of others had made wartime marriages after a few hours' acquaintance. But already I had an idealized image of her, and I believed that was true of her image of me, too. I had to be tender with her and selfless. Coupling would mean more to her than it meant to, say, the lioness. I was right. To my everlasting sorrow, I was right. Paydays were erratic in the Marine Corps, but liturgical. The paymaster sat behind a little desk in the company compound, and we formed a line in front of him. I thought he would never get to me. I was at the end of the line. I had been packing my gear. Taffy and I were to meet 3 hours later, outside the uniform shop, as soon as she could leave work and take the Ramona bus to Dago. Actually, I had no idea how much dough I would get. My sergeant's pay was $78 a month, but because the paymaster's visits were irregular and there were deductions for war bonds, I had never given cash much thought. I only knew that since my mother's visit, I had been stone broke. I'd had to borrow to take Taffy to the pictures. Had I been better informed, I might have anticipated the monstrous injustice that was about to be visited upon me. It happened, from time to time, that the Marine Corps would discover that it had been systematically overpaying a man. In that event, the account would be squared on the next payday. The paymaster patiently explained this to me as I stood, baffled and then apprehensive, before him. At last I said, "How much do I get?" Wordlessly, he slapped a quarter on the desk. "That's all?" I cried. He nodded, and I knew that there was no appealing a paymaster's decision. Frantically, I ran around the camp, trying to lay the sleeve on friends. All the raggedy-ass Marines were gone. There was Bearass, but he and his girl had a date at the Grant, too. In his tactful way, he suggested I take it up with the chaplain. So I was left with an erection and 2 bits. 25 cents bought exactly 3 minutes of conversation between Linda Vista and Ramona. I called Taffy, but it was impossible to explain such a situation to a girl, any girl, in 3 minutes. She was at first startled, then subdued, her voice so low that I could hardly hear her. I promised to get the money together somehow. Would she meet me outside the uniform store next Saturday? She mumbled. I didn't understand her and said so, and she said in a slightly higher register, "No, Sunday, at the zoo, where we were." I was about to tell her I would change the reservation at the Grant, but then my time was up. The line went dead. During the next week, I raised every nickel I could. I borrowed shamelessly from the raggedy asses when they returned from Liberty that night. I would have robbed a bank if I had known where one was. Altogether, I amassed over $100, enough to rent the hotel's honeymoon suite. In the zoo, I waited a long, long time. Darkness was coming down upon the park when she arrived in a dull frock, with a haggard, heartbreak look and eyes that avoided mine. She wore no ring. I studied the dress. "Did you molt?" I asked with hollow cheeriness. Then I tried to take her in my arms. She turned her cheek and let me peck it. She was standing stiffly, her elbows at her sides, clasping her purse as though she were afraid someone might snatch it. Someone did. I did. Again I tried to embrace her. She folded her arms high over her shoulders and pivoted away in that way girls did then when they were embarrassed or caught off balance. "Let's sit on the bench," she said. The weight of unshed tears hung in her voice. Feigning confidence, I told her I had made another reservation at the Grant and felt stunned when she shook her head decisively. "We really didn't know each other," she said. "We had been crazy to think of such a thing. She wasn't that kind of a girl. She didn't want her name to become a barracks joke." The words made no sense, but the bleak funereal music was clear. She had been ready the other day, but she wasn't now. The wine had passed its point. She finally said that we mustn't see each other again. Stricken, I just sat there, 140 pounds of bone, gristle, and dismay. I felt a grey, hopeless lassitude. Looking back across the years, I yearned to tell the sergeant, "Play for time, you jerk. Take her to another movie, get back on the campus track, let her laugh and warm up and then take her. She'll want you then." Instead, I idiotically hummed a few bars of Something to Remember You By, the broadest possible hint at the memorable something I wanted from her. She retrieved her purse and took a tighter grip on it. Fighting the pain in my chest, I looked over her shoulder at the night sky. A roving moon sailed through a white corridor of cloud. Then a wind vexed the sky, and stars were visible through rags of clouds. Taffy fell silent. I glanced down. A moonbeam rested on a long diagonal across her face, from eyes to lips. She had nothing more to say, neither did I. We left the park holding hands once more, but now as children walk hand in hand from a playground that has been closed, this one, for us, having just been closed forever. At the time, I invested the scene with the dimensions of tragedy, silver rain slanting on cruel lilacs. In fact, it was a temporary disappointment, like having to give up a good book before reading the last chapter. It seems merely poignant now, regrettable but remote. I knew little about Taffy and nothing about war. At that time I wasn't even aware of the naval hospital elsewhere in the park. Certainly I never dreamed that I would one day lie there, tormented by memories of horrors that, the day Taffy and I said goodbye, would have been incomprehensible to me. After the war, when my first book was published, I heard from her. She had become a Pan Am stewardess and was living in Paris. I was newly married, so my reply was merely cordial. But I still have flickering memories of her. As we parted on Broadway, a jukebox somewhere was playing, "We'll meet again, don't know where, don't know when." It wasn't true, yet I think of Taffy whenever I hear the lyrics of those years, when the Dipsy Doodle was a thing to beware, and there was going to be a certain party at the station, when the lights went on again all over the world, when she wouldn't sit under the apple tree with anyone else but me, and would walk alone and be so nice to come home to till the end of time. Thanks for the memory, Taffy. Here's looking at you, kid. That left May. Or May. I never learned how she spelled her name, and I'm not absolutely sure she knew either. She was very dumb, a bleached blonde in her late 20s, a borderline alcoholic who would have turned pro if she hadn't had money coming in from another source, and hadn't, rightly, feared the competition. Her problem was that her orifice was tight, but I had no inkling of that beforehand. All I knew was that a gunnery sergeant in Fox Company had met her in a dance hall south of the new Camp Pendleton and shacked up with her. The gunny had made a habit of passing on this sort of information. He was known, I groaned to report, as the battalion's lay preacher. So I went from Taffy to May, from the sublime to the ridiculous. May did have a certain gargoyle charm. She was a character out of George S. Kaufman by Ring Lardner, with Al Capp acting as a coucheur. I had never known such a woman. If Taffy was upper middle class, May was underclass. Her complexion was purpled by past pleasures, and after my second drink in the dance hall, her mouth developed a disconcerting way of seeming to wander all over her features. She was wearing about 20 bracelets. She sounded like a light machine gun when she moved. From a distance, she had a sepia-30s prettiness, but her mouth had been eroded by at least a decade of promiscuity. Her voice had the timbre of a saxophone. When she raised it, it sounded as if she was telling somebody to sack Troy. She accepted my assurance that I was a friend of the gunny without batting a false eyelash, and before I could even order new setups, she had yanked me to my feet with a startling flex of muscle, crying, "Let's dance!" That was her first remark. Her second, after a half-dozen clumsy steps, was, "Just because I let you dance with me, don't mean I'm going to let you get into my pants." Her third, by now her hips were really swatting me, was, "On the other hand, it don't mean I won't." She had my riveted attention. Back at the table, she chug-a-lugged both our drinks. "Booze ain't good for a man, dear. It takes the lead out of his pencil." Then, at her instruction, I paid an outrageous price for a fifth of Southern Comfort and gripped my shrinking roll. "So much for prelims," she said practically, seizing the bottle, taking my arm and kissing my cheek with slack, rubbery lips. "Now I guess you want to get your end wet. I got Freddie's car outside." Dazed, wondering who Freddie might be, I meekly followed her to a coupe in the lot behind the hall. I had hardly slipped behind the wheel when she was in my arms. Only the young and the short can achieve coitus under those circumstances. I had youth, but I was 6 feet tall, and after several acrobatic attempts, May conceded that we couldn't make it here. We would have to go to her furnished room. I glided out to the highway, following her directions. "There's just this one thing," she said, powdering her nose and rattling on as I raced toward whatever nest she had. "I've got this new bed, one of them Murphy beds. It came new last week. I think they sold me a lemon." She patted my arm. "But you'll fix it for sure." I heard a liquid sound. She was gulping Southern Comfort from the bottle. Chez Elle was an incredible warren. Langley Collier couldn't have improved upon her spread. A snafu of clothes and jars and empty bottles, more bracelets, necklaces, a douchebag, shards of broken glass, unravelled toilet paper, and at least 3 mousetraps littered the floor. To an anal compulsive, it was shocking. The only illumination was provided by a bridge lamp which had fallen on its side. By this light, I saw that May, between gulps from the bottle, was stripping. She looked at me with transomed eyes. She said, "Hurry up!" She was naked now, and I saw what looked like a tattoo on her lower abdomen just above her pelt. It was a tattoo. I held the lamp closer and incredulously read, "Abandon hope, all ye who enter here." She was beaming down at me, obviously proud. "Oh, come on," I said, disgust momentarily mastering lust. She pouted. "It was Freddie's idea." I asked who Freddie was. She said, "My husband." I cried, "You've got a husband?" "Oh, he's over in England, in the 8th Air Force," she said casually. "Probably screwing one of them duchesses. Just think of it as lend-lease, the old switcheroo. Sometimes one of his buddies comes by and takes a poke at anybody I'm with. But you can't make an omelette without breaking eggs," she ended inanely. So that was how she lived, on an allotment. And yet, against all sense, I too had undressed. She looked and gasped. "Jesus, I don't know. I'm on the tight side." But in the next instant our tongues were entwined. If it hadn't been for the broken glass and uncertainty about what else lay underfoot, I think I would have floored her there. Instead, I looked around for the bed. She panted, "In the wall!" and pointed to 2 straps dangling from what could only be the Murphy bed. "Take one and I'll take the other." She had been right. It was defective. The strength of the springs holding it upright was almost unbelievable. I stood back, wiping my brow. "Some marine," she jeered. I asked, "How do you get it down alone?" She said, "I can't. I sleep down the hall with my girlfriend Mabel. I complained to the company. They're sending somebody down tomorrow a.m. by a Herculean effort during which I expected a rupture any moment, and with ferocious tugging from May, the bed descended. Almost at once it started to rise again. We grabbed it. "That's the other thing," she said defensively. "It don't lock down good. The catch was put on wrong." She showed me. I tugged. It was like trying to pull a grenade pin with numb fingers. I skinned a knuckle and wiggled the gizmo back and forth until it held. Then, drenched with sweat and smelling of it, we boarded the mattress and I mounted her in the missionary position. I didn't fit. May reached around, groped in the debris below, and produced a jar of Vaseline. "We'll give you a grease job, that's what we'll do," she said confidently. I tried again. She started to moan, but I simply couldn't penetrate her. Then the bed began to rise again. Following the law of gravity, my knees slipped from her hips to her armpits, bringing my equipment over her chin. She shrieked, "I ain't going to eat that thing." I apologized, explained, and told her we'd have to start again, by which I meant the bed. The rest would have to wait. Again we brought it down on the floor and worked on the catch. May, who had felt horny, was beginning to feel rage. She was hanging over me, her lank hair shaking and that mobile mouth slurring obscene invective. I told her I wasn't very good at that sort of thing. She heckled, "And you call yourself a man?" "But not a mechanic," I said, wincing as I lost skin to the damned catch. She said, "Wait a minute, I just remembered. I got instructions." Bare, dripping perspiration, my desire slackening, I studied the leaflet she brought under the dim light bulb. It resembled the manual on detail stripping a bar, or the one for building the Colonel's flytraps. May was gurgling Southern comfort. I think she had already given up. But I felt challenged. Shafts, rods, gears. It completely baffled me. Still, I read on. Like Mount Everest for Mallory, the Murphy bed was there. We made 2 more feeble attempts. If we had been physically compatible, I think I would have rolled us off the mattress and chanced the glass, the mousetraps, and whatever else lurked below. But it was useless. My strength was ebbing. By the time I grappled with my skivvies and khakis, I was not only frustrated, I was also suffering from motion sickness. I rolled off the levitating mattress and left May sprawled across the litter below, snoring and belching. The bottle was almost empty. I wanted to break it over either her head or the bedstead, but I was too tired and too sore with lover's nuts for either. Instead, I stumbled downstairs, found a payphone, and called a taxi. My score was still 0-0, and after paying the cabbie for the long trip, I was broke again. I couldn't even afford a tip. The driver was surly. I was surlier. 9 hours later, I led my section aboard the APA Morton into a compartment below the waterline which would be our pent home throughout the 17-day voyage to Guadalcanal. 2 light meals would be served each day. We would have to bolt each down while standing in a maximum of 3 minutes. We could expect to grow filthier each day. The only showers would be salt water showers. We couldn't exercise, there was no room, or, for security reasons, remain on deck, where we might catch a breeze after darkness. Already, as the winches shrieked and the transport built a welter of water beneath her hull, we were encountering one of the miseries of life on a transport. The deafening sound of the PA system, the blast of, "The smoking lamp is out. Now sweepers, man your brooms. A clean sweep down, fore and aft." But my thoughts were elsewhere just then. I wasn't thinking of May or Taffy, not even of my mother. I was trying to make peace with my very personal, existential, Augustan faith, remembering Psalm 107, about men that go down to the sea in ships. Most fighting men cannot imagine their own deaths. All those I knew on that ship were confident that they would see America again. I wasn't. I had no premonition, but I knew the odds and was uncomforted by them. In any event, my destiny was non-negotiable. I stood on the fantail, watching the California coastline recede as the Morton and the rest of the convoy began zigzagging to evade submarines. I was aware, and depressed by the knowledge, that this was probably my farewell to the United States. I hoped I would fight well. I felt ready. I felt that my men were ready. I thought of Baudelaire, Fleur du Mal. It was a vision of beauty, but of evil beauty. Except for occasional patches of shoulder-high kunai grass, the blades of which could lay a man's hand open as quickly as a scalpel, the tropical forest swathed the island. From the APA's deck, it looked solid enough to walk on. In reality, the ground, if you could find it, lay 100 feet below the cloying beauty of the treetops, the cathedrals of banyans, epils, and eucalyptus. In between were thick, steamy, matted, almost impenetrable screens of cassia, liana vines, and twisted creepers, masked here and there by mangrove swamps and clumps of bamboo. It was like New Guinea, except that on Papua the troops at least had the Kokoda Trail. Here the green fastness was broken only by streams veining the forest, flowing northward into the sea. The forest seemed almost faunal, arrogant, malevolent, cruel, a great toad-like beast, squatting back, thrusting its green paws through ravines toward the shore, sulkily waiting to lunge when we were within reach, meanwhile emitting faint whiffs of foul breath, a vile stench of rotting undergrowth and stink lilies. Actually, we had been told in our briefings, there were plenty of real creatures awaiting us: serpents, crocodiles, centipedes which could crawl across the flesh, leaving a trail of swollen skin, land crabs that would scuttle in the night, making noises indistinguishable from those of an infiltrating Japanese, scorpions, lizards, tree leeches, cockatoos that screamed like the leader of a banzai charge, wasps as long as your finger and spiders as large as your fist, and mosquitoes, all carriers of malaria. If wounded, you had been warned you should avoid the sea. Sharks lurked there. They were always hungry. It was this sort of thing which had inspired some anonymous lyricist among the 19,102 Marines in the first convoy to compose the lugubrious ballad beginning, "Say a prayer for your pal on Guadalcanal." On the 19 transports in the original force, the Marine infantry had been subdued, and not just because of the air of foreboding gloom which spread like a dark olive stain over the entire island. Down below in the holds, enlisted men had been quiet, though awake, writing letters, sharpening bayonets, blackening the sights of rifles and carbines, checking machine gun belts to make certain they wouldn't jam in the Brownings, rummaging in packs to be sure they had sea rations. They carried canteens, kabar knives, and first aid kits hooked to web belts, packs of cigarettes, Zippo lighters, shaving gear, skivvies, mess kits, shelter halves, ponchos, 2 extra bandoliers of ammunition for each man, clean socks, and, hanging from straps and web belts like ripe fruit waiting to be plucked, hand grenades. Some were literally whistling in the dark. "My mama done told me," or just milling around in the companionways. There wasn't much room to mill. Around the heads, people were almost wedged against each other, a few inches from sodomy. There was no place to sit. Tiered in 5s, and, where the overhead was higher, in 6s, the bunks were cluttered with helmets, helmet liners, knapsacks, pick and shovel entrenching tools, and 782 gear. During the long hours of waiting, the tension and frustration became almost unbearable. There was a myth then and throughout the war that this had been planned, that the Marine Corps wanted us infuriated when we hit the beach. But the Corps wasn't that subtle, and the men needed no goading. Morale was sky-high, reminiscent of Siegfried Sassoon's account of British esprit the week before the Battle of the Somme in 1916. There was harmony in our company mess, as if the certainty of a volcanic future put an end to the occasional squabblings which occurred when we were on one another's nerves. A rank animal healthiness pervaded our existence during those days of busy living and inward foreboding. Death would be lying in wait for the troops next week, and now the flavour of life was doubly strong. I was trying to convert the idea of death in battle into an emotional experience. Courage, I argued, is a beautiful thing, and next week's attack is what I have been waiting for since I joined the army. If you were a Green Marine fresh from civilian life, waiting to race ashore on Guadalcanal, vitality surged through you like a powerful drug, even though the idea of death held no attraction for you. Your mood was an olla podrida, a melange of apprehension, cowardice, curiosity, and envy, soon to be discredited by events, of the safe, dry sailors who would remain on board. The bluejackets who would come closest to your destination were the coxswains of the Higgins boats. At the signal, "Land the landing force," their little craft, absurdly small beside the transport, bobbed up and down as you climbed down the cargo nets hanging over the APA's side. Descent was tricky. Japanese infantrymen carried 60 pounds. A Marine in an amphibious assault was a beast of burden. He shouldered, on average, 84.3 pounds, which made him the most heavily laden foot soldier in the history of warfare. Some men carried much more: 20-pound BARs, 45-pound 81mm mortar base plates, 47-pound mortar bipods, 36-pound light machine guns, 41-pound heavy machine guns, and heavy machine gun tripods over 53 pounds. A man thus encumbered was expected to swing down the ropes like Tarzan. It was a dangerous business. Anyone who lost his grip and fell clanking between the ship and the landing craft went straight to the bottom of Sealark Channel, and this happened to some. More frequent were misjudgments in jumping from the cargo net to the boat. The great thing was to time your leap so that you landed at the height of the boat's bob. If you miscalculated, the most skillful coxswain couldn't help you. You were walloped, possibly knocked out, possibly crippled, when you hit his deck. Judged by later standards, the Guadalcanal landing of August 7, 1942, America's first offensive of the war, encoded Cactus, was primitive. Amphibious techniques were in their infancy. The Marine Corps lacked essential information on tide, terrain, and weather. There were no reliable maps, no LSTs, and no DUKWs, those amphibian tractors, or boats with wheels, which were then still in the experimental stage. The heyday of underwater demolition teams lay ahead. World War I weapons were standard because the Corps, though part of the Navy, used Army equipment and didn't get new issue until the last GI got his. One curious weapon, which we came to loathe, was a machine pistol called the Rising Gun. It rusted quickly, jammed at the slightest provocation, and was quite useless in the jungle. The twin-purpose entrenching tool hadn't reached the Pacific yet. Again, men were carrying 1918 relics. Even-numbered men had little picks, and odd-numbered men little shovels. Once ashore, they dug in together. The Higgins boats were crude prototypes, and on shore-to-shore operations they were towed by Yippies, or YP, Yard Patrol craft, wide, smelly speedboats which emitted deafening chug-chugs and clouds of sparks, making stealth impossible. The landing force's chief job was to complete and use the unmatted 2,600-foot airstrip the Japanese had already started, but there were shortages of cement, valves, pipes, pumps, prefabricated steel sections for fuel storage tanks, Marsden runway matting, and earth-moving machinery. There was one small bulldozer. Only the operator was allowed to touch it. Under a standing order, anyone else approaching it was to be shot. But the basic attack concept, shelling a beach and then sending in waves of infantry, had been established. Marines were grouped 36 men to a boat. The boats for each wave formed a ring, circling until they fanned out in a broad line and sped the wave shoreward. Aboard, you crouched beneath the gunwales, seasick, struggling to keep from vomiting. There was no Dramamine then. Most men compared the seasickness to that on a terrible roller coaster ride, May's Murphy bed raised to the nth degree. Coxswains in later operations learned to give their wretched human cargo smoother rides, but none improved on the precise timing that August morning at the canal. 0 hour had been set for 9:10 a.m. At 9:09, the first wave splashed ashore toward the quiet, shell-shredded palms on Red Beach, 4 miles east of the Lunga River. Lacking opposition, 2 battalions of the 5th Marines, my father's old regiment, swiftly established a 2,000-yard-wide beachhead. My own landing, much later, was typically inglorious. As our wave circled nauseously, a cloud no larger than a turd appeared in the sky. It grew. At the instant my boondocker hit the grey sand, the skies opened and 10 inches of hard, driving, torrential rain began to pour down like that San Diego lioness pissing on a flat rock. Guadalcanal is shaped like a paramecium, or a fat, limp letter S on its side. Though different in dimensions, and though mostly uninhabitable, the canal is about the size of Long Island. The right tip droops down toward New Caledonia, 800 miles away, then the closest Allied stronghold. The left end rises to a tip, Cape Esperance, which on a map of New York would put it in the vicinity of Long Island's Great Neck. North of the cape lies the volcanic isle I had mistaken for the canal, Savo Island, White Plains on the New York map. To Savo's right are the Florida Islands, chiefly Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo, near Bridgeport, Connecticut, if the map analogy is held. The body of water between the canal, Savo, and the Floridas may be compared to Long Island Sound. Before the fighting, it was known as Sea Lark Channel. After more than 35 ferocious naval battles had been fought there, with, among others, 65 major warships sunk, roughly half American and half Japanese, Sea Lark was rechristened Iron Bottom Sound. During my 7 months on Guadalcanal, the Sound and its surrounding islands became as familiar to me as an Amherst apple orchard. I especially remember one wreck. During a midnight, moonless hull-to-hull slugging match off Tassafaronga Point, in which 2 of our fighting admirals were killed, Dan Callahan and Norman Scott, 3 Japanese transports were run aground. One day, long afterward, I decided to board one of these hulks. It was not one of my brighter ideas. I dove through a shell hole beneath the waterline and found myself in a compartment full of water. My head hit the overhead. No air. My lungs were bursting when, by blind luck, I found the original shell hole and darted through it, bleeding from a half-dozen cuts. Then I remembered the warning about sharks. The Australian crawl was invented by a Solomon Islander, Alex Wickham, but I doubt that he could have matched my dash to shore. The first European to sight these waters was Alvaro de Mendana de Neira in 1597. Looking for King Solomon's legendary islands and failing to find them, he named the archipelago Islas de Salomon, and the canal itself after his Spanish birthplace, Guadalcanal. It is an extraordinary fact that until our landing, the Japanese Army's General Staff hadn't even heard of the island. The Japanese Navy had been managing affairs in the Solomons, and the Army-Navy split was even greater in Tokyo than in Washington. But no one could really be expected to keep all of Mendana's islas straight. There were archipelagos within archipelagos, 1,001 isles in the Russell subgroup alone, and even more in the New Georgias. Altogether, the Solomons sprawl across 900 miles, roughly forming 2 chains. The channel between these chains, leading down to the canal, became known as the Slot. It was a natural funnel for planes and ships lunging southeastward from the great Japanese bastion of Rabaul to the northwest. Even better, from the Japanese point of view, their approaching armadas coming down the Slot would be masked, for those defending our reconquest of the canal by Savo. Informed that the Marines were ashore on the canal, a senior colonel on Hirohito's general staff wondered aloud what the Americans could possibly want with an insignificant island inhabited only by natives. The colonel's superiors and his opposite numbers in the Japanese Navy could have told him. Their men had been on the canal for 6 weeks, bossing Korean labourers. Termites was our word for the Koreans, who were building the airfield. That field was what the Americans wanted. News of its construction by the Japanese, radioed to New Caledonia by Australian coast watchers who had stayed on their islands and gone bush, meant Australia itself was on the Japanese hit list. It must be remembered that at the time Dai Nippon's troops had not once tasted defeat. Victories had become a Japanese narcotic. Until Guadalcanal, their only encounters with the Marine Corps had ended in defeat for us. The loss of Wake Island, the surrender of the 4th Marines on Corregidor, and an inept submarine-borne raid on the Gilbert Islands by Carlson's raiders, 2nd Raider Battalion, where 9 men left behind by Carlson were beheaded. "Where," Tokyo Rose jeered after that, "are the United States Marines hiding?" Convinced now that they were invincible, the Japanese were taking dead aim on the landing beaches nearest Brisbane, Sydney and Melbourne, the population centres of the last surviving Allied power in the South Pacific. It was the threat to Australia that triggered American seizure of Guadalcanal. That audacious move was as desperate as Hitler's losing gamble that same year at Stalingrad. Its chances of success were dim at the outset. They were to grow dimmer. The battle's architect was Admiral Ernest J. King, the U.S. Chief of Naval Operations. The documents of that year indicate that King's fellow service chiefs could not decide whether their goal in the Solomons should be to stop the Japanese there or merely to harass them. But the admiral was determined to drive them back. Unfortunately, the old sundowner picked as his campaign commander Vice Admiral Robert L. Gormley, a poor selection because Gormley was convinced the situation in the Solomons was hopeless. Alexander A. Vandergrift, the soft-spoken Marine Corps general who would head the hodgepodge of Leatherneck units making the landing, had been told that he needn't expect a combat assignment before January 1943. Various convoys were carrying his troops, reinforced regiments from 2 Marine divisions and miscellaneous battalions, toward New Zealand when Vandergrift was told he must recapture Guadalcanal and its surrounding islands, denying the area to Japan on August 1st. That was less than a month away. Appalled, the general begged for a postponement. King moved the date back to August 7th, but that, he said, would be his last concession.